Unity is the only way forward, and unity is what will give each of us the power to make change.
Each of us can make a difference, no matter how big or how small.
We can be better tomorrow and the next day and for the next generations to come.
Coming together to lift our voices in unity. And I think that's what we need to focus on. Music is a universal language, and it brings us together.
When we come together, when we pull together, we can always do better, and we can always make beautiful things.
In a unity, in unison. I mean, because what is the greater goal of why we're here, but to be here and connect.
Good evening and welcome to the special virtual edition of SphinxConnect 2021 Unity. First, I want to thank each of you for coming together to celebrate so much of what has been most important this past year, our artists and leaders. While we cannot be physically together, it fills me with great pride and gratitude to share this important moment with each of you at a time when our commitment to La Familia is most meaningful. I must thank my incredible team members who have worked tirelessly to put this week together, but especially I call on each of you to make some noise in your living rooms and dining rooms or kitchen tables. For Abigail Venman and Andre Dowell, Sphinx's two team leaders who have built our very first virtual global convening and the first ever virtual Sphinx competition amidst a global pandemic. They deserve our greatest praise and admiration for their perseverance and ingenuity. The team and I chose the theme of unity for this year's convening long before our world was to be brought down to its knees in 2020. It happened before our artists were to become silenced across the world, before our family members were to fall ill, before canceled opera premieres and the newly commissioned symphonic works were replaced by the Brady Bunch-like squares on our screens. It was before we lost one of the greatest civil rights icons of our time, John Lewis, and before the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd shook our numb world in the most profound of ways. It was also before the solidarity statements earlier than implicit bias consultants becoming the hottest commodity on the market, before our philanthropic institutions calling for racial equity, and before DEI became the code for the scorecard of our conscience. Before we knew that our country and the very foundation of our democracy would be shaken once more earlier this month to remind us that division and injustice are still so profoundly at the core of our shared reality. We knew then, but we certainly recognize now, that the only way we are to survive this costly dual pandemic is through reliance and trust in one another's strength and integrity, by standing tall for those who are tired of fighting, by doing it, not just saying the right thing when it matters, by taking risks when they are not popularly blessed by consensus, and by hearing from those who do not think nor look like us and whose pain and challenge are greater than ours. Today, this is everybody's fight, everyone's time to lead, every single one of us who holds the pledge of allegiance to artists and leaders of color, all those who hold the privilege to act for more than just ourselves alone. Now, some of you may recall that this last summer, Sphinx called upon our partners to make a 15% commitment to diverse programming and board and staff inclusion, as well as a 10% budget allocation to diversity and racial equity work. We stand by that call and stand ready to work together with any partner ready to tackle those concrete, measurable steps. The talent and readiness of our artists and leaders will inspire anyone with a resolve to make different choices this year. Sphinx saw a record high participation through our cumulative applicant pool growth by more than 60% this past year, through quadrupling the number of artists reached through our National Alliance of Audition Support, and awarded more than $800,000 in grants and scholarships since this past summer alone, while pivoting every single one of our programs to the digital space and ensuring that every student and every artist was accounted for. And before I yield my place to our incredible esteemed speakers, I am hoping that you will ask yourself this one question: what will I do this time for unity? How will we go beyond that one composition programmed, that one artist engaged, one commission, the one DEI speaker who gave a Zoom talk to our teams earlier this year? The time has come to join our hands and commit wholeheartedly to the discomfort of change. Once this weekend comes to an end, once the tears are dried and the urgency of this work yields to the dangerous comforts of status quo, may we all pause in remembrance of those we lost, in gratitude to those who lead this work today, and in awe and anticipation of all that we can do together for our collective good in unity. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished opening plenary guests. Elizabeth Alexander is a poet, educator, memoirist, scholar, and a cultural advocate. She serves as the president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the nation's largest funder in arts and culture and humanities in higher education. Dr. Alexander has held distinguished professorship at Smith College, Columbia University, and Yale University, where she taught for 15 years and chaired the African American Studies Department. She is a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. She serves on the Pulitzer Prize Board and co-designed the Art for Justice Fund. She composed and delivered Praise Song for the Day for the inauguration of President Barack Obama in 2009, and is an author or co-author of 14 books. Her books have been finalists in multiple Pulitzer Prize categories, and her vision for philanthropy today is transforming the world as we knew it. Today, Dr. Alexander will be interviewed by another luminary in our world, Jenn White. Jenn is the host of 1A. A seasoned journalist and podcast host, she has worked in radio since 1999. She has held several on-air positions as host of the station's local 2-hour midday show, Reset with Jenn White, and The Morning Shift. You may recall her work in Making Oprah, Making Obama, and 16 Shots, which chronicled the fatal police shooting of Laquan McDonald and the trial of Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke. Many of our Michigan friends will also recognize Jenn's voice from All Things Considered Michigan Radio. An inspirational public speaker, Jenn has moderated numerous on-air gubernatorial and mayoral debates. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us offer a hearty Detroit welcome to our plenary guests, Elizabeth Alexander and Jenn White. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and usually we'd be able to be in a room together, but we are doing this virtually with all of the adventures that go along with virtual events. But it's just such a pleasure to share this time with you and to share it with the wonderful Elizabeth Alexander. And I'm so excited to talk to you because I think we've all had a lot of time in recent months to think about the different roles we play in our lives and where those things intersect. And I'm curious how you're thinking about the intersection of your life as a poet, as a scholar, as an educator, as an advocate. How are you thinking about those intersections these days?
Well, first of all, Jenn, I'm so happy to be talking with you. It is an honor, and I'm excited about this conversation. And to everybody who's watching right now, my heart to Sphinx. Since I've started in philanthropy at the Ford Foundation to my time at Mellon, I've known and admired the beautiful, powerful work that Sphinx does. I've seen AFA's leadership in motion, and it is inspiring. I love that you are in Detroit. I was just talking to my parents, and I said, "Gotta go to Detroit" when I got off the phone. So I am happy to be in that great metropolis with all of you today. And Jenn, yeah, I mean that's the question, right? I mean, you know, we've now been apart from each other for almost a year. We've at the beginning of March, I think we all remember, you know, the markers by which I think, oh, I was in Chicago then, so that was before March 12th. Or, you know, I was in this place then, it couldn't have been. Or yes, I remember that happening at my kitchen table because that's where I am now, and this is where we've been. And I think that in the fear and the anxiety and the anger and the upset that has not just been from a global pandemic, but more specifically, a global pandemic unmanaged and mismanaged, a global pandemic that didn't have to keep us apart from each other in this particular way, a global pandemic that revealed to us that which so many of us already knew, but even for people who watch closely, it was stark the way that people of color and people who did certain kinds of jobs and people at a certain economic place in our society were affected so disproportionately by this pandemic. And then, you know, again, to remind us, that then tumbled into, again, as we know, not the beginning of racial violence and racial injustice. You know, when people say to me, oh, is the Mellon Foundation a social justice foundation because of Ahmaud Arbery's death, you know, because of Breonna Taylor? And, you know, the whole world experienced that, but those are two stories among many stories on a very, very long continuum. But I think that what came to a head last year was a much wider sense in American society that the hatred and the violence and the racism was fundamental to how the country was being run, and that it didn't come out of nowhere. And so with that understanding, in this solitude, what are you going to do? Yeah. How do you help? And I think, you know, being able to, thinking about the, you know, kind of unlikely, I mean, I start as an artist, I start as a poet. Alongside with that, I'm a teacher, a professor. Those are my long careers. Those are my long selves. And I think that the fundamental belief that the light and power and soul exchange that happens with art is something that is a unique superpower. It is something that shows us where we are, where we've been, where we can go. It's literal light itself. And the opportunity, having tried to make a lot of written things myself and share them, and seeing the very unexpected ways that art travels in the world. I've also always believed that creating opportunities for other people to be able to be in the fullest of their creativity, and for communities to have access to that, and for communities to have access to the power of, in the case of my own career, higher education, and the way that that deep critical thinking allows us to understand ourselves in the world. And that centering, you know, I come out of African American studies. So, you know, I know for a fact that if you don't understand and can't ask the questions that African American studies offers you, you will not understand America.
That brings me to a really interesting thought. As you were talking about what we've experienced over the last 10 months, and anytime someone reminds me that it's been 10 months, it's a little startling. Mm-hmm. But what are you thinking about the role art can play in helping us as a nation process what I think is collective, but not necessarily shared grief? it feels like this
Interesting.
nation is in sort of an upheaval of grief, and it's coming out in all kinds of ways right now. But what role can art play in helping us process that?
Well, that phrase you use is really giving me something to think about: collective, but not necessarily shared grief. That's very powerful. And I think, I started us so deep in the blues. I started us, in that long litany of what we've been in, because I think that what art does offer us, I mean, how even do we know who we are? Mm-hmm. How do we, and let's just think about music, since we're talking with these extraordinary people today, right? What do we know about the need to make song, and about what do we know about the sorrow songs? What do we know? Frederick Douglass, one of so many wise lines that he left us, but he wrote, as you know, slaves sing most when they are most unhappy. Mm. And what he was going up against was, don't think that these are just, these people are singing because they're happy. Don't interpret that this way. They are singing to be a community. They are singing in order to tell their story. They are singing in order to communicate. And again, when you think about the blues, the pre-blues, the blues notes, the notes that you hear and how they affect you in the Black musical tradition, that when Black people sing How I Got Over, that they are asking a very profound philosophical question that we're still trying to figure out the answer to. And so I think that art has given the people who are gifted with the ability, not only a way to express themselves, but to express themselves for the community, and to move people in a way that actually, nothing else has that specific power to move us.
One of the things we really grapple with in journalism, and it's something I think about a lot, is the fact that right now in our country, we don't have a shared set of facts. Mm. And I think a lot about how this period of time in our nation's history will be written about, how it will be remembered, depending very much on who's writing those history books. But I'm curious to know how you think, as a poet and as artists more broadly, there is opportunity to capture the truth of this moment in a way that I think is sometimes difficult for journalists to do completely. Mm-hmm. And maybe even historians to do completely. Is there an opportunity here for art to step in?
Well, I think that, one of the things that I've always thought that art can do, and again, this is a lesson that I take from working in African-American culture and with the question of the archive in Black culture, because one of the things that we know about archives is that your stuff is more likely to be preserved and preserved well if you are wealthy, if you are male, if you are white, and if you are affiliated with an institution that exists over time. So if you think about, just all of the legacy stuff that legacy institutions have and keep, that nothing wrong with that, but that means there are a whole lot of other voices and a whole lot of other stories that we need to search for. So before I turn to art, that's where I want to say that, the kind of deep archival study that looks at the things that people in communities kept safe themselves, that looks in church basements and attics, that learns how to read and interpret texts and photographs that are not necessarily already in perfect archival form, that's a very, very crucial part of our history. I think that also, I don't know who said it, but there's that saying that journalism is the first draft of history. And I think that the responsibility of journalists, and we have many, many different media now with which to do it, to, the storytelling work, the listening work, the way that journalists themselves bring equity and inclusion principles to the work that they do when thinking about, okay, this is one piece of the story, but who's not in the room, who's not at the table? And those are questions I ask myself several times a day, every day. Who's not in the room, who's not at the table? And it's a very, very useful reset, I find. And then finally to art, I think with the things that history and journalism can't necessarily capture, I think that what art gives us is, I actually do literally think it is literally soul transmission. I think that that's where, human exchange happens. I think a poem offered, voice offered, is really meant to say this soul to the other souls. And I think that, again, back to the superpowers of art, when you think about how you feel when you are in a room with extraordinary paintings that take you elsewhere, that evoke certain feelings. If you think about music that makes you cry, if you think about, we saw, just the other day at President Biden's inaugural, a young woman, Amanda Gorman, gave millions and millions of people words that she wasn't giving us prose, it was a poem. And it was something that captured for so many people the essence of what we've been through and where we are going, spoken by a young person, by a young woman, to all of us. So I think that those are some of the ways that we mark human existence and progress, and what art in particular can do with that work.
And we should, of course, note again that you stood in that same place for an inauguration, presenting the nation with words meant to uplift and capture memory. I want you to tell us about you and your path. Before we get there, I just want to remind people, though, as we're talking and you have your own questions, don't forget to share those questions in the chat. We will have about 20 minutes at the end of our conversation for Q&A. But Elizabeth, tell us about your journey and how poetry became a pathway for you to express yourself.
I didn't start out thinking that I was going to become a poet. I was born in Harlem, USA, and grew up in Washington, D.C. And all kinds of folks in Washington, D.C., a lot of Black people when I was growing up. The city was 3/4 Black. It was a glorious, very Black city. And a lot of lawyers, among other things, in Washington, D.C., a lot of politics. My father had been very involved with justice work, with civil rights work in the government, in and out of government. And so I think that I probably thought that some kind of advocacy was what I would do, though I'm sure I didn't know the word advocacy. I wouldn't have thought about what that was. I was an English major, and I first wanted to become a journalist. I worked at the Washington Post, and again, just in thinking about who tells what stories, one of the things I remember very well about that time, it was when the anti-apartheid movement was in full swing. And there were a lot of very, very brilliant Black reporters at the Post at that time. And I remember there was a big fight where the Black reporters were told that they could not cover the anti-apartheid protests because they would be biased. You remember this as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, and who tells what story is an interesting question. But what was really great for me in doing a lot of freelance writing around the paper was that being a journalist, it made me get past my shyness. It meant that I went into my city to places that I had never been before. I did a story about a writing group at Lorton Reformatory. I did the prison outside of DC. I did stories all over the city and really learned deeply about this place where I grew up. And I think that the closer I came to human beings and their stories, the more I saw that journalism was not going to hold what I wanted to do, because the story kept going further in my head. And of course, you can't do that if you're writing a newspaper story. So I had written some fiction when I was in college, and I applied to, on a whim, encouraged by my mother, applied to a graduate creative writing program with fiction. But I went there because the poet Derek Walcott, whose work had affected me deeply, was there. And I thought, let me go to him and let me just sort of present myself to him and see, you know, I didn't even think I wanted to be a poet. I thought, I revere this writer. And I showed him lines I had, unclassifiable lines. And he said, I think you're trying to write a poem, but this is not a poem. And then he took my lines and wrote them and lineated them on a page and said, now you see, a line break is what makes a poem. Now he said, and he was quite gruff, and he said, now go away and don't come back until you have some real poems to show me. And so literally that was the moment. And I like to think that if we remain attentive and open to the moments, you know, that beautiful saying, it's either when the student is ready, the teacher shall appear, or when the teacher is ready, the student shall appear, because I've been on both sides of it. That was what I was supposed to be doing. I can trace it back now to listening, to profound interest in humans, to profound interest in song. I was a very serious dancer when I was young. So thinking about precision and musicality was something that I had practiced. It really then led to other things, you know, no jobs, there's no job called poet. You write poems, but you don't have a job called poet. And so I come from practical people. My mother said, keep going to school. So I got a PhD in English and had always loved teaching, had taught dance, had taught young people, was always sort of teaching and whenever I could. And then that entered in a very wonderful context in which to be a poet, which was to be teaching and reading and writing about the arts at the same time.
Explain a little bit more about the importance of those mentorship interactions you had when someone said, you know, here's how you do it, or gave you guidance or gave you a little push, and the importance of that in this world, in the arts, to have people who are willing to step up and provide some guidance and support.
Well, I think I want to make a distinction between mentorship and mentorship in the profound and sacred work of making art, and where things sometimes go awry, which is excessive careerism. Because I think that, you know, for an artist, you know, if you're a serious artist, at the end of the day, you have to, it's completely from within. You are alone. You have to be a self-starter. No one can help you, actually. Honestly, that's the darn truth. No one can help you. So, you know, the ability to go into a lonely and dark place and pull, you know, blank canvas that becomes the extraordinary things that we see. Instruments that are mastered that then put sound into the world. I mean, it's absolutely amazing what people do. So I think that to the mentorship, I think being able to listen very carefully and to remember that you can be mentored by people you know, but you can also be mentored by people you don't know. I have been deeply mentored by writers I've read. I've been deeply mentored by Thelonious Monk, who probably had passed away by the time I was aware I loved his music. Mm-hmm. You know, in that work of listening and listening and listening and learning. And in the case of writers, but with other artists as well, I'm a great student of their interviews, because I think that sometimes we ask of our artists to tell us over and over and over again, not just how to do it, not just the nice question you asked, which is about kind of tell me about yourself, but rather, how do I get published? And I'm cranky about that, not because I actually I help people, you know, all the time. But I think that it's important that within that help that we understand that there are so many ways. And in fact, you know, I think that one of the byproducts that is a blessing of this pandemic is that there is so much gorgeous, rich content that we can watch on our screens. I mean, the other night I was eating my dinner and I was in Arizona watching the poet Natalie Diaz with Natasha Trethewey and Joy Harjo. I mean, what?
Wow.
You know? And that's, you know, there's something at 5, there's something at 6, there's something at 7. So I think that that actually that's going to be an interesting thing to see how the arts community continues to make things available once we're able to be in the same spaces again.
Talk a bit about the role of philanthropic institutions and some of the ways they can rethink or reimagine gatekeeping and what supporting the arts equitably really looks like or could look like.
I think so. I at Ford for 2 years, I was the director of creativity and free expression, which is the culture wing of the Ford Foundation, and came, you know, not out of a career in philanthropy, but you know, out of teaching, writing, and also building creative institutions, being part of building the Cave Canem organization for Black poets, which has a beautiful Detroit representation, co-founded by Cornelius Eady and the Detroit poet Toy Darracott. So we'll shout that out. And so seeing how kind of from nothing you could make a really, really rich and vibrant community. And all of that helped me when I came into funding the arts, because I did understand something about, and also actually chairing an African-American studies department, being in an under-resourced field, poetry and African-American studies, knowing how to make something glorious on a shoestring, but also knowing the real injustice of who is funded and how disproportionate it is. I came with that justice drive as a funder, and as well for, you know, looking at wealthy institutions who also threw up their hands and, you know, said, oh, well, you know, we couldn't find any, well, we couldn't, or, you know, could you give us a grant so we can figure out how to, like, no, you know, we're not going to pay you to do what actually is about looking at the glory of the diverse pools of talent that we have. We can't ignore that anymore. We're going to look at people and, you know, thinking about Sphinx in particular, but also so many other organizations. With my colleague Emil Kang, we are such believers in artist-centric organizations and solutions, and about the incredible creative problem solving and big dreaming of organizations that really have artists as part of the making, part of the forming, part of the shaping. So those questions I mentioned before, you know, who's been at the table, you know, it can't just be luck. It's got to be thoughtful. It's got to be methodical. It's got to be fair. But I think also it's got to be excellent, because I think great art, I have reverence for it. It's not just a pastime. You know, I want everyone to have access to it, but that doesn't mean that it's everybody's job. We're all gifted at different things. So I think always saying, how do we identify the art that is truly transformative, that's truly stirring? And, you know, to the gatekeeper question, I think that that's why hiring with tremendous care, you know, I mean, people who have thought hard about these questions their whole lives, people who have come from fields, people who are respected in their fields, people who can call around and understand, okay, who are we missing? What haven't we seen? How can we turn this from a different angle? Having really excellent, if we want to call them gatekeepers, if they operate with care, I think that's just us doing our jobs as well as we can.
You mentioned access and, you know, the way the pandemic has caused a sort of nimbleness and how that's maybe opened access to certain types of artistic experiences that we didn't have access to before. I was really fortunate in that I grew up in Detroit, and I'm in the DC area now, but growing up in Detroit, it felt like there was so much art around me all the time. And I just feel so blessed because I know it shaped so much of my worldview. How, on the other side of this pandemic, can we think about accessibility in a different way? Because I think on the other side of this, we're all going to be so eager to get out of our houses. You know, it's just like we just want to get out back into the world, get things back to normal, however you want to qualify that. But what are some of the lessons to learn from this time about how we can reach new audiences, reach people, make things more accessible to people who potentially wouldn't have access to some of these spaces?
Well, I think that is a superb question. And I think that it is, it's not one that I can answer with confidence because right now I feel that we're so not on the other side. So, I mean, I think, you know, what we've been dealing with as funders in solidarity with our great artist community is really trying to be responsive in the last year to how incredibly hard all sorts of artists have been hit. That 96% of artists have had an economic hit from this pandemic. That I don't know what the exact number is, but a huge number fully unemployed. That if you just think about the gig, you know, and I mean, we watched this as funders, but we also watched it as friends of artists and looked at all of their 2020 fall like dominoes. And all of that income that they depended on, gone. And let's talk about just one genre, for example, our jazz musicians. There are no, how we're going to get back in the club is not something that we can figure out just now. So, I mean, I think I look at some of the ingenious things that people have made, and I know that some places have had musicians testing and coming together in empty spaces, and then for a modest sum of money, more modest than if you actually went, you can go and listen. But what we also know is that is not the same thing as what it means. You know, my last pre-pandemic moment with people was at the Village Vanguard watching Cecile McLaurin Salvant. And it was such an extraordinary evening, and like a human being sweated on me, like this close, like it is. And, you think about that and you almost can't imagine. And jazz musicians, I have a lot of friends who are jazz musicians, and they've told me, we haven't figured this out yet. We haven't figured this out yet. So I feel very focused as a funder on being helpful to people in 2021 as well as in 2020, and seeing seeing where it takes us. But technology will remain and should remain our friend in this, I think. And so that's where I think that there'll be some interesting innovation, even though there's no substitute for the human.
Just a quick reminder, we'll be going to Q&A in just a few moments here, so make sure to send your questions in so we can pass them on. You know, the theme for this year is unity.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of discussion right now about what unity looks like, what it means, whether unity can be present in the absence of accountability. How are you thinking about the role art can play in helping us answer that question?
Well, even before I get to the art part, I'll answer the first part. You know, true unity is impossible without accountability. And I think what is unity? I mean, it's such a great theme because it's actually a big question. You know, when I was growing up, there was I'm trying to remember what radio show it would have been on in DC. I was a big radio listener and learned so much actually about jazz on DC radio shows and DC radio stations. As well as the Quiet Storm and et cetera. And unity in the community was a phrase that we heard a great deal. Unity in the community. And that was talking to, kind of Black people talking to Black people. That was people who had a sense that they belonged together. But this is a very, very diverse country. And the divisions have been aflame in the last little while. So I actually am not interested in false unity. And I don't think we should be. And I think that sometimes if you can't come to resolution, then you need to work in, beloved community to spread the light and do your work. And let it shine as an example for others. Because, the great Toni Morrison said the very point of racism is to distract you from your work. And I think that, we can spend a lot of time without real reconciliation trying to come together. But I think that there are actually other communities that can be very, very mighty and powerful. And I think that, every powerful movement has art in it. I mean, if you think about, we talked about the sorrow songs, but if you think about the freedom songs, I have DC on the brain. I was listening to Ethelbert Miller on the radio today. He was talking about, in a long conversation, but, the role of the freedom songs in the civil rights movement and in organizing, and of people coming together, and the way that common purpose comes when people sing together and sing those words together. That is a very powerful function of art. Words that are distilled and clear, words that are repeatable. June Jordan, poem for South African women. We are the ones we have been waiting for. Barack Obama used those words in several of his campaign speeches. We are the ones we have been waiting for. Wow, let's meditate on that and see what it means to think not that we are waiting for a savior or a leader, not that who is elected president is the final word, but rather what can we do to be powerful communities moving forward. So those are some of the things that art can do.
We've got some great questions coming in. Here's the first one. Referring back to statements about art as light, multiple truths and versions of history, and the effect of legacy institutions' biases. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on reorienting legacy arts institutions to presenting more diverse work?
That's a great question. I think that, one of the ways to do it is to shift funding and to say, funding is not automatic And I think that it's also very important for us as funders to be evaluative, to say, okay, organization X has been supported for this amount of time, for this amount of money. What are the outcomes? What happens if, I use with my colleagues the phrase, the roving spotlight of philanthropy. It's not random, but it's a simple principle of sharing, to say, okay, what have we achieved over here? All right, but look over here, what could these folks do? Let's see what that looks like. So I think that that's one way that then I think, you give a little more power over here, and sometimes the legacy institutions can then, in a best case scenario, be inspired by and learn and see something about the vitality and what they have missed presenting that others are supporting and presenting. If you look at African American art, for example, and if you look at the role of something like the Great Studio Museum in Harlem, and there is barely a Black artist who is now finally being shown in the mainstream institutions, who wasn't in some crucial way supported by the Studio Museum in Harlem. And yet, over the years, the Studio Museum in Harlem has not received the kind of resources. They've just done it. So I think that, to have kind of non-extractive, but rather like honest and inspirational understandings that the legacy institutions exist in an ecosystem, and that there is a lot of talent that they need to be aware of, and that real transformation is not one little curator, one person on the French horn. Mm-hmm. Real transformation is actually at a much greater scale than that. And it's powerful. It's beautiful.
Our next question, let's see, is poetry has changed so much from Dickinson to Angelou to Gorman, and is still so relevant. How can arts organizations embrace that change too that is happening within their own art forms?
Well, that's interesting. I think if we had all the time in the world, I would even thicken that question and talk about simultaneous streams of poetry, that alongside Dickinson was Walt Whitman, and the Walt Whitman strain goes more directly to Maya Angelou and Amanda Gorman, and the Dickinson stream goes in another way. There's always been variety and simultaneity. And I think that in a way, one of the powers of poetry is because it is not remunerated in any significant way, at all. I mean, there's not a lucrative poetry book contract out there. As I said earlier, there's not a paid job called poet. So the beauty of that is, existing outside of the marketplace means that, you make it because you have to make it, and people find it because they have to read it. I've always been interested with how, with books of poetry, which often come out in very small editions, and this was before poetry circulated as it does on the internet, that there was the hand-to-hand life of a book of poems is much greater than with other kinds of books. It's passed to this one, to this one, to that one. Somehow it circulates. So I think that it's not just in poetry. I mean, I think all cultural organizations have to realize that there is just tremendous innovation by definition happening all the time. I mean, that's, the great artist is restless. The great artist is uncomfortable in one mode. The great artist is never fully satisfied. And so that's what we ought to be listening for.
Next question. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Jenn, for this fascinating conversation. How can powerful legacy-oriented institutions implement DEI in sustainable rather than performative ways?
To sort of underscore what I said earlier, we're not all funders, and funders aren't everything, and philanthropy isn't everything. I mean, philanthropy is actually not how, there are also private donors, and there's earned income, and there are lots of ways that cultural organizations carry on. Performative DEI, tokenism is another word for it, is something that is familiar in our society. It's nauseating, and to be tokenized, to be made a token, I try not to go anywhere by myself, which is to say, how do you always bring other people in with you? How do you call other people's names? How do you say, in a great Entasaki Shange poem called "Baby You So Pretty," she's saying that someone's saying, "Oh, baby, you so pretty, baby, you so pretty, baby, you so pretty," and she says there are millions and millions and millions of us all over the globe. So I feel like coming with that attitude and resisting tokenism is really, really important.
The next question is, with the accelerating demise of print journalism and the rise of dis and misinformation, can you give examples of how you envision music and the arts can play a role in truth-telling and documenting while engaging and challenging audiences?
There are many kinds of truths. And I guess I would push on, and I'd love to know what you think, Jen, the premise of the question.
Yeah.
The accelerating demise of print journalism, for sure. I mean, that, newsrooms are indeed, that is a shifting world. And the rise of dis and misinformation, that is certainly true, and we certainly have seen it with not just with the previous president, but with the resistance to calling a lie a lie.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lie. And it took much too long for that to happen at the pace that it needed to. But I actually wonder, for you, Jen, what would you say about what's happening in journalism today?
There are a few things happening all at once. There is a contraction in print journalism specifically, but we're also seeing expansion in other places. The pandemic notwithstanding, and all of the economic issues that go along with that. And so what I'm seeing is for newsrooms that can be nimble, especially at the local level, there's so much opportunity there. I think a lot of times when we're talking about media, we're talking about it through a national lens. But I've worked in some really robust local radio stations in Michigan, in Chicago, that were doing incredible reporting. And because I work in public radio, the financial model was different. We weren't relying on advertising dollars so much as we were relying on community support. And that actually sustained us over some of the other economic hurdles that print journalism found themselves facing. And so the larger issue I think journalism is facing is what you just talked about, was calling a lie a lie, and not being shaped by political norms, but responding to what's happening in politics with the most vigorous commitment to truth telling. And I think that got a little cloudy over the last 4 years. And interestingly enough, in most newsrooms, people of color, people from marginalized communities were ringing that bell really loudly and saying, there is a problem here. But because of leadership structures that were overwhelmingly white and male, they were ignored. Or to harken back to something you said earlier, in covering the BLM protests over the summer, they were told, you can't cover that, you're not objective. So we are having some conversations within journalism about how not to repeat the mistakes that happened over the last 4 years. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that everyone has a seat at the table and everyone has a voice. It's not that they've just pulled up a seat and they're sitting there silently, but you need to listen to the journalists in your newsroom who are from marginalized communities, because their perspective is valuable. It's different. It's important, and it will help complete the coverage you're trying to present. But that's a whole other other little discussion. So we're not telling complete stories if the voices aren't in the newsroom.
Yes, and so too. I mean, thank you for that, because that extends to the cultural organizations that we're talking about as well. And I think that just simply to add, the truth of art is not measured by factuality. And so I think that, but it's truth nonetheless. It's a truth of feeling. And I think that also one of the things that art can do is it can be future looking. It can be speculative. There's a wonderful, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of this artist, but there's an artist, Black woman, who made a big billboard in Pittsburgh that said, there are Black people in the future. And imagine all of the evocativeness of living with that and coming upon that, all of the questions that it's raised. So I think that there are so many things that art can do alongside what I think we need in journalism.
Our next question says, from your unique vantage point, how do you see the arts collectively supporting one another? Collectively supporting one another while moving towards inclusion without feeling the need to suddenly shun the canonical art that we have, yes, thank you, art that we have always loved, even if it has been overly centered.
Okay,
and I hope that was a complete question because my screen jumped.
Okay, I'm going to unpack some of the pieces of that question. Thank you for that question. I think read and read, listen and listen, look and look. I think people shouldn't worry so much about decentering. People should just want to know more, hear more, do more. The canonical that we have always loved. Who is the we? What is the canonical? Speaking for myself, I can say that there are many writers in the poets in the English mainstream canon. When I went to graduate school, our oral exams included not a single person of color and 3 women writers. Everybody that we had to study in our qualifying exams. I liked many things on that list. I find Shakespeare magical. There were many, many, many things that were wonderful. But do I think that there were other things that I should have been taught? And did I and my colleagues work overtime because we knew there were things we weren't being taught? So we just read them and had study groups and worked and made collectives and studied on our own. I think, and then were there also some things in that canon that I could do without? Sometimes things that have been canonized and venerated do not necessarily hold up. Once Toni Morrison's in the running, she knocks people out of the way. If you think about just, the constraints of a syllabus, a semester, I wish I could read every single thing, but having to make choices. So that's how I would answer that question. Consume voraciously, but also know that that also there are many canonical texts that present women, perhaps not at all, people of color in stereotypical terms. I don't need to read that again.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question. I'm involved in partnering performance arts and science, dance, music with astrophysics. My intention isn't to teach science through dance, music, but explain the arts as enhancement to intellect, as is science. Can you speak to the importance of integrating the arts?
I love that. I just love what that person is doing. That's fascinating. I have a poet friend who, and I hope he'll do this. His university has in one of their science, they own wetlands on the outskirts of the university, and it's where the scientists, discover things and learn things and study. And he said, what if I could bring in a group of poets and give them microscopes and have them go to the wetlands and just, make poems. There's a writer who I love called Diane Ackerman, who wrote a book called A Natural History of the Senses. She lives in Ithaca, New York. She's a poet, but she's also someone who writes powerfully about the natural world and who is deeply informed by the natural world. The great Maria Popova, who some of you all might be aware of from her extraordinary platform, Brain Pickings, where she writes about reading and writing and being and loving and being alive. And every year she puts on something called the Universe in Verse, where she brings poets to read poems that are in some way engaged with science. Even just the fact that science has specialized language, and poets love that. So I think that these kinds of crossings that this questioner is doing are just absolutely exhilarating.
Here's another question. Can you speak to the great importance of our youth and their education in music and art, whether or not they are creating something consumable?
Yes. I mean, in our perfect world as we imagine it, I think every single young person would have some kind of serious study of some art form, depending on their own interest, and that would be a part of school. I mean, if you think about, the birth of hip hop and how it was tied to New York City public schools and schools in the Bronx being defunded and underfunded. So all the violins and the violin teachers and the music teachers and everything were coming out of the schools, but there was technology. So people started playing around with that, those who had musical talent. So a great art form was born. But every single young person should have the opportunity. They should have the opportunity to be serious about sports and have a context and training and support for that. To use our bodies, these temples that we live in, to do something with that energy. Don't we wish we still had it? All of that extraordinary energy that young people have, and what it means to work on a team. And similarly, I think from studying the arts and from my own personal perspective, from having the good fortune of being able to have, very, very, very powerful and serious dance training. Everything I know today about discipline, about sticking with things, about working through pain, about not having immediate rewards, but long-term rewards, all of it comes from seriously studying dance. The great Arthur Mitchell of the Dance Theater of Harlem, that great, wonderful, beautiful man, used to love to talk about how because they have a very great school that's being run beautifully and Anna Glass and Virginia Johnson are incredible leaders there. But he said, most of my kids don't become dancers. They do other things, and I believe they do those things better and have richer and more productive outcomes and options because of this community and the seriousness of their study.
Well, that leads very neatly into the next question. It says, we live in a time where the corporate model is everywhere and where we as educators are asked to measure our students' progress and success. In your mind, what should success look like in arts education?
In arts education? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I asked that question, I ask it more about with our philanthropic funding and with the arts in general, not just with arts education, because that's not the area that we're in as much, is what does success look like? And, I think one answer is success looks like communities enriched by the arts, accessible to many. Success looks like the transformative and mind-altering power of serious education and critical thinking, so that we can reflect on who we are and where we are in this world and be more useful. So those are things that are hard to measure. And I think that there's work that I hope we'll be able to do with colleagues that really, that's a very hard question, that really, it's not probably tests. I know that there are some studies that talk about economic robustness in communities where there are more arts organizations that talk about health outcomes in both directions, in communities where there are or aren't arts organizations. So those are some of the things that we know. But I think that operating from the powerful belief that human beings uniquely make art and have forever, and it is part of what sustains us and enriches us and enlightens us. So how do you begin to measure that? Not sure, but I know that everybody needs to be able to come through the door.
The next question says, thank you both. Elizabeth, have you been a lyricist or librettist? And can you speak to the intersection of words and music, perhaps the amplification of meaning?
Oh, thank you for that question. I have on a few occasions. I've worked with the composer Elena Rohr, and we worked together to set some of my poems to music, but it was really very collaborative. I just heard from her, actually. She's going to be recording it with the singer Stephen Salters, who some of you may know. And we actually, many years ago, performed it in Washington at the Terrace Theater. That was amazing. It's called Five Men, and it's 5 Black men. Paul Robeson is one of them. Du Bois is one of them. And that was a beautiful thing. And there are a few others who I've worked with, and a few others who I've also let go off with some poems and do their thing in a less collaborative way. I also wrote one play that was a verse play, and that had a number of arias in it. That was a long time ago, a really long time ago, called Diva Studies. So these have been wonderful excursions for me. And right now my life doesn't have very much art making in it, but there are many chapters, one hopes.
I think this will be our last question. Foundations offer a lot of support to the arts and oftentimes sway what programs PWIs prioritize based on the interest of their grantor. What suggestions do you have to sustain culturally relevant programming when and if funders shift priorities?
Well, let me talk about what we do at Mellon and how we think at Mellon, and kind of some about what I think maybe an optimal grantor-grantee relationship is. We're not trying to tell anybody what to do. We're not trying to tell anybody what to make. What we're trying to do is be respectful and respected partners, to be helpful, if we can be beyond the paycheck or the grant, if you will. There are the resources, but also, my colleagues have so much knowledge and heart, and because we see across the sector, we have a lot of experience with different kinds of solutions that we offer when we build trusting partnerships, and we want to offer ourselves when people are trying to figure things out. That said, philanthropies, like other organizations, do have strategies. And I think that, so for example, when I came to the Mellon Foundation, before I was even invited to be the president, I said, if you choose me, I see this, I will run this as a social justice foundation. That is the evolution we will make. Every penny that goes out the door, we will be able to talk about it and think about it and see it and decide on it through a social justice lens, which can mean a lot of different things. So that was a shift. We made that shift. That's the truth. It happened. So it doesn't mean, the thing that's tough is there are never enough resources at any given time for more than a small portion of all of the people who are doing amazing work. And that's just the truth. But I think that hopefully, as good actors in a world of creators we revere, we hope that by lifting up certain ideas and working with clarity and focus and strategy to sort of say, we think this is important. I mean, that's how the DEI work gets done. It's only when you let work be exemplary, so that it can hopefully be inspiring and empowering to others.
So we actually do have time for one final question. Any suggestions for being encouraged to create art when during these difficult times, artists can feel very uninspired and discouraged to create right now?
Well, here's the thing about inspiration. I don't know anybody who needs to be happy to make art, right? By which I mean, artists are such brave humans. And that bravery means being able to stare unflinchingly and alchemize that which is difficult. It's not about bringing good cheer. It's about the fullness of our humanity and our human experience, honed and crafted in a form that it can be offered to others. And I think that in that, one of the profoundest things, even in hard times, that art can do is it reminds us that we are never alone. And that even in our woe, that the caliber of what we are experiencing, others have suffered, others have survived, others have made beauty, others have made soup from a stone. And that's what art, I think, shows us. And I know of no greater gift.
That's a lovely place to end our conversation. Elizabeth Alexander, it has been such a great pleasure talking to you. And thank you for all of your great questions and sharing those with us as well. Hopefully this won't be the only time we get to speak.
I'm sure it won't. Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you to everyone who we wish we could see. Thank you for the great engaged questions. And thank you for coming together and your time tonight. Thank you.
What an inspiring way to set the tone for all of us. Thank you, Elizabeth and Jenn. We are so deeply grateful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. While we do not have the opportunity to hug one another as we normally would and celebrate in person, I look forward to the chance to see you back here tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a day of inspiring conversations ranging from the impact of social media today to the importance of cultivating cultural entrepreneurship from an early age. Of course, don't forget that tomorrow night's also a plenary featuring the incredible Will Lieberman at 5 p.m. Eastern. See you soon.